Attack on the USA. 4 airliners are hijacked, turned into devastating bombs. Thousands of people are feared dead.
I hope I live. It's coming down on me.
The world, shaken, recoils in horror. This is a special extended edition of The National. Good evening again. I'm Peter Mansbridge. They were deliberate. They were deadly. The most devastating terror attacks in the history of the United States. Tonight, the most powerful country in the world is asking, how did this happen? One thing is clear. They did not see it coming. At 8:45 this morning, hijackers crashed an airliner into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York. Just 20 minutes later, a second plane plowed into the South Tower. Smoke and flames shot above. Debris and the doomed fell below. Then, around 9:40, another explosion, this time in Washington. Another hijacked plane hit the Pentagon. And just after 10 a.m., the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed and vanished in a cloud of dust, soon followed by the other building.
I hope I live. I hope I live. It's coming down on me. Here it comes. I'm getting behind a car.
At 10:10, a 4th airplane crashed outside of Pittsburgh. A September morning gone mad. The images are extraordinary, the impact only beginning. The number of casualties is a mystery at this hour, but it's hard to imagine that the number of people killed will not be in the thousands. Even so, there's a frantic rescue effort going on tonight in New York City to find people still alive underneath the rubble. For the entire story of this terrible day in Manhattan, we're joined now by reporter Steve Irwin. Steve.
Peter, New York's nightmare began just as most people were coming into work when a hijacked passenger plane flew straight into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Smoke poured out of the skyscraper, and the scene was a mess. Then, less than 30 minutes later, it happened again.
Oh my God!
A second plane was hijacked, and as people around the world watched on television, it flew straight into the other tower, punching a huge hole through the building.
And I heard a roar, and I looked around thinking that it had to be a helicopter, and I looked up and I saw the second plane hit. It had to be a commercial-sized airliner.
What went through your mind?
That it couldn't be real. Just that it couldn't be real.
We thought it was an accident. When we heard there was a second one, we definitely thought it was terrorism at that point.
There are typically some 50,000 people working every day in these 110-story buildings. Those inside began to flee while emergency workers rushed in a frenzy to the scene.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion, and everybody just started running for the door. Everybody was trapped. Eventually, when the dust lifted, I saw some light and started screaming for everybody to go out towards the light.
As soon as it got hit, I was thrown to a window. So I was very lucky to get out. There's a lot of people that didn't get out. There's a lot of people coming down the stairs, burnt up.
A big explosion happened. Some guy came out. His skin was all off. I helped him out. This is him all over. There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
Well, the firefighter, somebody with little light came eventually, and we were following him.
And go to.
What did you do? I'm sorry.
The police officer told everybody to form a human chain, and we held on to each other, and he flashed the light, and he directed us to Building 5, and we went out Building 5.
Did you see people bleeding, and what did you see?
Oh, everybody could see. You want blood? Here's blood. Everybody's bleeding. People are laying all over the floor. It's horrible. And I was there the first time, and this is twice.
But there was an even greater catastrophe. The South Tower, its steel beams apparently melting from heat and fuel, collapsed on itself.
I hope I live. I hope I live. It's coming down on me. Here it comes. I'm getting behind a car.
Unbelievably, a half hour later, that scene too repeated itself. Floor after floor of falling debris. Billowing smoke and soot seemed to cover the lower portion of Manhattan Island.
I saw it blow and then ran like hell. Thank God. I'm 69, but I can still run.
And late this afternoon, word that another building at the World Trade Center complex has collapsed. Area hospitals are already overflowing with the injured and volunteers trying to help them. The rescue effort has been slow because of fire and the possibility of more explosions. But officials say that late in the evening, workers pulled at least 2 survivors out of the rubble. And there are reports of cell phone calls from underneath the rubble by survivors hoping to talk to relatives. But the good news is far outweighed by the bad. More than 300 firefighters are missing.
We believe that many of them are gone. We'll keep looking.
New York officials were stunned and somber.
And we will strive now very hard to save as many people as possible and to send a message that the city of New York and the United States of America is much stronger than any group of barbaric terrorists.
There are other reports tonight about what actually happened on those planes. On at least one airplane, hijackers armed with knives stabbed flight attendants, took control of the plane, and then crashed it into the World Trade Center. Peter?
Steve Irwin reporting to us tonight from New York. Well, New York was just the beginning. As the horror of what happened at the World Trade Center was still just starting to sink in, reports started coming in from Washington of explosions and fireballs. Then the chilling news that a passenger jet had crashed into the Pentagon, leaving a gaping hole in the military nerve center of the U.S. Tonight, word that hundreds of people may have died in the Pentagon, possibly as many as 800. The CBC's Adrienne Arsenault joins us with the latest. Adrienne.
Peter, many of the flags here are at half-mast. The city is operating under a state of emergency, and all night long along that street we've been watching motorcade after motorcade escorting fuel trucks, medical and military personnel, and some seemingly very worried politicians.
Any warning, any suspicious package?
Before their eyes, the terror of New York flew into their own backyard. At 9:45 a.m., an explosion at the Pentagon.
And the next thing I know, there was this tremendous explosion as it hit the Pentagon. I looked right.
The military nerve center of the United States, workplace of more than 20,000 people under attack. A hijacked American Airlines 757 with 64 people on board had just left Dulles, Virginia, en route to Los Angeles. Then it changed course and crashed into the West Wing. All 5 floors collapsed.
An enormous gap has been cut in this building.
Mercifully, Pentagon officials say, the plane hit a newly renovated and minimally staffed section of the building. But death here would be unavoidable, and the first account of casualties seems staggering. Fire officials say that hundreds may be dead, maybe as many as 800. They are still struggling to account for the missing. As the effects of the escalating catastrophe started to sink in, the United States military at home and overseas was put on the highest alert. And in Washington, a state of emergency was declared.
Everybody back. Everybody back.
The White House, the Capitol building, all empty. And by mid-morning, every federal building in Washington was evacuated, sending nearly 250,000 people into the streets. Across town, early, unconfirmed reports of an explosion at or near the State Department. On any other day, that would be crisis enough. Here, today, it just gets added to a horrible list.
Very angry. Very angry that somebody has such callous disregard for human life.
And it would continue. Just before noon, a 4th commercial jet crashed just outside Pittsburgh. A passenger aboard the United Airlines plane had called police to report a hijacking only moments before it went down in a cornfield.
I happened to hear a plane come through. It sounded like it was running normal. When it come down over top of me, I seen it go nosedive straight into the ground down here.
Westline commuters, we're operating trains as quickly as possible.
A Across the country, many Americans scramble to get away from big cities and possible targets. Most high-profile tourist attractions were closed. Most train and bus stations jammed.
West Line, track 1. It's load and go. We'll fill them, and they'll go out.
And by midday, for the first time ever, the Federal Aviation Administration grounded every plane in the United States and diverted incoming flights. As of right now, nothing will be flying into or out of here until at least noon Wednesday.
But there is some activity in the skies. Every now and then you hear a rumble that sounds like thunder. Those are the sounds of fighter jets. They have been patrolling the airspace over Washington all day, and we are being told repeatedly that they are looking out for planes that may be entering the restricted airspace that may be a threat, and that they are authorized to shoot those planes down. Peter?
Adrian, what can you tell us about the latest reports from the recovery and rescue operation of the Pentagon area?
Well, what we're hearing from the fire chief in Arlington is that the death toll he believes could range from 100 to 800, but that uncertainty might not be cleared up for days. There are parts of the Pentagon that are still under active fire, they say, that are still burning. The fuselage is still in the west wing of the building. The fire chief said earlier that it had virtually disintegrated and that there are parts of that building that are still too hot for firefighters to go in and attack aggressively. So they are pulling back for the moment. They're going to try to do what they can through the night and really go at it in the morning. So there's a lot of uncertainty and still a lot of danger at the Pentagon.
Adrian Arsenault reporting to us from the streets of Washington tonight. U.S. President George Bush was not in Washington at the time of the Pentagon attack, but as you may have seen, he is there now. And he's assuring the nation that while a powerful symbol of the U.S. government may have been attacked, the government itself is still operating smoothly. With more on the president's response to this Tuesday of terror, here's the CBC's David Holton. David.
Peter, for George Bush, this was obviously by far the toughest day of his presidency so far. But it's also being described as the cruelest day in U.S. history, a day that shattered this country's sense of its own security.
Get ready, kite. Yes, kite. Get ready.
It's just after 9 a.m. President Bush is at an education event when an aide gives him the first whispered news of the New York bombings. His face clouds with anxiety.
At the count of 3, everyone should be on page 1.
Minutes later, his first official response.
Today, we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
For more than 3 hours, though, as U.S. forces at home and abroad are put on the highest alert, nothing more is heard from Bush or any other senior official. Public fears aren't eased when Bush flies to an Air Force base in Louisiana, apparently still unsure that it would be safe to return to Washington.
The resolve of our great nation is being tested. But make no mistake, we will show the world that we will pass this test.
A terrible, terrible tragedy has befallen my nation, but has befallen...
More words of defiance from Secretary of State Colin Powell on a visit to Peru.
They can destroy buildings, they can kill people, and we will be saddened by this tragedy, but they will never be allowed to kill the spirit of democracy.
As thousands flee downtown Washington,
Clear down the whole area.
There's confusion, shock, and disbelief.
We can't move. We can't get anywhere. Everybody's concerned that there might be other buildings targeted.
Now I know what my parents felt like on Pearl Harbor Day.
It's really inconceivable to us that someone would do that, and so you really can't understand the enemy.
But in this case, was the enemy Osama bin Laden? U.S. officials already say bin Laden is their prime suspect, that only his terrorist organization, Al-Qaeda, has the resources and sophistication to carry out today's coordinated attacks. But in Pakistan and Afghanistan, where bin Laden is based, the Taliban government denied that he's involved.
We strongly condemn it. We want investigation to be carried out.
We could hear detonations coming from that northern area as well.
Later, explosions and rocket fire lit up the night sky around the Afghan capital. Washington quickly denied that this was a U.S. retaliation attack and said the fighting was started by Afghan rebels.
In no way is the United States government connected to those explosions.
This evening, Bush returned to the White House after an unexplained visit to the Strategic Air Command headquarters in Nebraska. This was part of his address to the nation tonight.
I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
Bush also ordered federal departments here to be reopened tomorrow, obviously wanting to send a signal that the U.S. government won't be knocked off track by the bombings. But no one has any illusions here, Peter, that it may be a long time before Americans feel safe again.
What are the latest indications, David, from the intelligence front on the part of the United States as to what may have caused this?
Very few. In fact, there have been the first early complaints from both Democrats and Republicans complaining that there's been a massive intelligence failure, that officials appear to have had no advance warning that these attacks were going to take place. But there is some evidence already, Peter, that there's been intelligence coming through after the attack. Senator Orrin Hatch, a top member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, told reporters a couple of hours ago that, in fact, there have been communications intercepted between Osama bin Laden supporters in the U.S. Communicating after the attacks. Also, he mentioned the likelihood that one Osama bin Laden supporter aboard one of those four hijacked aircraft may have been identified.
All right, David, thanks very much. David Holton in Washington tonight. Well, from Washington, let's go back to New York City, where our Joanna Remiliotis is near the scene of where the rescue effort is taking place in the southern end of Manhattan. Joanna, what's the latest from there?
Well, Peter, the ambulances that have been lined up here on standby for hours are slowly moving out. Reports are that 2 people have been retrieved from the rubble, both police officers. One, apparently, his leg had to be amputated in order to get him out. He was pinned beneath the rubble. The focus of the triage that has been set up over here, that medical units dealing with the injured, is focused primarily on the rescue workers themselves. There haven't been any accounts yet of people who have been trapped in the rubble for hours since this morning of having been helped at this point tonight. What we're seeing is dogs going in to sniff the surroundings. There are also the rescue workers following them. Again, the major challenge is the dust and the debris. They just can't seem to see enough through it. There's also something we should mention. There's a huge effort by volunteers here. 500 doctors have volunteered, not only on this site, but spread throughout triages across the city. And there are many people here just handing out water, just doing their bit and doing what they can. There's also, I don't know if you can hear this across the line, but there are helicopters overhead, so a very, very, big reminder that the security issue is still alive, and it's a major one. And at the moment, the confusion seems to have abated somewhat. We are seeing ambulances coming out, so that's a hopeful sign. The official policy here is that the people who are trapped inside are alive. There are people who are alive underneath that rubble, and the priority is to get them out.
What kind of stories are you hearing from those involved in the rescue effort?
Peter, they're shocked. I mean, there's no real way to describe it. I mentioned to you earlier one man who just came up to me, and like I said, I don't think he saw me. I think he just stopped at a body and talked about how this was the biggest nightmare of his life. And he looked at me, but he didn't see me because he's witnessing, he's kind of looking at the horrors that he's just witnessed. And that's the sense we get here. Despite the fact that there are hundreds of people on the ground, there's an incredible amount of calm and quiet. And I think that's mainly because the people are so overwhelmed by the task ahead of them. And as I had mentioned earlier as well, one firefighter was just shaking his head talking about how he had helped one man, one injured man get out, who was later sent to hospital, and he just kept shaking his head thinking that was one man. I just helped one man, and there are thousands in there, potentially thousands in there. And that's what they're dealing with. I think they're simply overwhelmed by the task, but they're going at it.
Give us a sense of who's involved in this rescue effort now. Obviously, as you say, many medical response teams, firefighters. Right. Who else?
There's the Marines have come here, so has the National Guard, and the primary focus is to relieve the people who are already here and who have been here, some for about 10 hours already. They know this is going to be a long operation that will go way into the night and obviously into the next several days because the task is so enormous. So already shifts are coming. You know, one of the first groups that we came across as we were walking through the deserted streets of Manhattan trying to get to this site were trucks who had come here from Albany, relief efforts, or have been sent out. So the whole state of New York is kind of pulling together on this one, and the focus is the fact that many shifts will be needed because this is a long exercise.
Joanna Remiliotis reporting to us at this hour, as she will throughout the night, on the rescue efforts underway in New York City. Thank you very much, Joanna.
You're welcome.
The shockwaves from today's horror traveled to Ottawa, putting the national capital on alert. Prime Minister Chrétien appealed for calm, said the government had beefed up security here just in case, and he offered the U.S. Canada sympathy and whatever help it needs. Here's Paul Hunter.
It didn't take long for the effect of the attack to be felt in Ottawa. Heightened security was everywhere. Police doubled their numbers on the streets just in case something were to happen here. At the U.S. Embassy, the biggest and most important American building in Canada, all non-essential workers were told to go home.
Sir, can we get your reaction to what's going on inside?
No comment right now. Thank you.
Those who worked nearby wondered, could the U.S. Embassy be a target?
I'm really scared. I want to go as far away from here as possible.
The Prime Minister heard about the attack during a breakfast in Ottawa with Saskatchewan Premier Lorne Calvert.
We have talked with the RCMP, with the Solicitor General and the head of the RCMP, and with the Chief of Staff and Deputy Chief of Staff of the Army, and everybody has increased the level of security everywhere.
Planes on the way in. That was made clear in the sky above Whitehorse this afternoon. Canadian fighter jets tracked a Korean plane when there were fears of a possible hijacking. It turned out the plane was simply having fuel troubles, having circled for too long. Those in charge of Canadian security said they were indeed doing all they could.
We have a very strong security intelligence teams in the U.S. and in this country. Obviously, there's been a desperate, terrifying act of terrorism that we will all have to deal with.
I can assure you we are doing everything possible to gather the very best intelligence so that we can use that intelligence to respond appropriately to whatever threat there is to Canadians and obviously other embassies and so on in Canada.
Even so, the Israeli embassy in this Ottawa office building was evacuated anyway, as were all Israeli embassies around the world. Here, nearby office workers were sent home early too, just in case.
Just sheer relief fell over the whole office, you know.
Relief in the end that nothing terrible happened here, with sympathy on behalf of all Canadians for victims of the horrific act.
Canadians show their solidarity with our neighbors, and the news to come when we discover the number of people who died will be probably very tragic.
Some Canadians are already expressing their feelings here at the U.S. Embassy, tonight bringing flowers, cards, and poems in a show of sorrow and sympathy for Americans everywhere. Paul Hunter, CBC News, Ottawa.
The Foreign Affairs Department says it will be at least a day before it knows how many Canadians may have died on this day in New York City and possibly in Washington. But one Canadian death has been confirmed. Garnet Bailey, also known as Ace Bailey, from Lloydminster, Saskatchewan. His family has confirmed he was a passenger on one of the planes that crashed into the World Trade Center. Bailey was the director of pro scouting for the Los Angeles Kings and a former member of the Edmonton Oilers. He was one of two members of the LA Kings scouting team that was on the plane. Now back to a busy night in the national capital. Joining us now from the CBC's Parliamentary Bureau, Jason Moskowitz, our chief political correspondent. Jason.
Well, Peter, we just mentioned the chances of Canadians being killed in New York, Washington. Foreign Affairs, as you know, put out a telephone number for Canadians to phone if they feared for friends, loved ones. Now, we're told that 12 to 20 operators have been taking calls since noon today and that they've been inundated with calls. One would assume that a Canadian having a friend or relative in New York or Washington particularly New York, would phone and find out their well-being. If they're phoning Foreign Affairs, one would assume that there could be reason to phone Foreign Affairs because there's a real fear there. As you said, Peter, there are no casualty figures out, but there are Canadians, a lot of Canadians, very concerned about other Canadians in the New York area.
Now, Canadian forces also being marshaled to try to help the situation in the United States when requests come through. Have there been specific requests for help yet?
The Prime Minister's office says no. However, we do know that tomorrow deputy ministers and assistant deputy ministers of the key departments will get together to discuss strategy, to coordinate their efforts. This is security and certainly intelligence and whatever help the Americans may ask for.
All right, Jason, thanks very much. Jason Moskowitz reporting to us again this hour from the nation's capital. Well, today's attacks raise serious questions about the state of American security and intelligence gathering. Gregory Treverton is one of the world's leading experts on national security. He's with the RAND Corporation. He joins us now from Los Angeles, California. Mr. Treverton, how can an operation of this magnitude be put together without the CIA, without the FBI, without someone on the American side detecting it?
That is the great puzzle. It really is a puzzle. We've been paying a lot of attention to Osama bin Laden, if he turns out to be the perpetrator. That's been a focus of attention by the American government, by intelligence, by the Defense Department for a long time. There have been, as you know, and have heard, indications over the last several weeks of possible dangers to American targets abroad, and that makes it very hard to understand why there were no indications of this very good, very elegant plan in the United States. We've heard this afternoon that some signals intercepts, some communications intercepts seem to point to Osama bin Laden, and that makes it, I think, all the more puzzling that there weren't such indications before the fact. I suppose at a minimum it underscores, first, really how hard it is to penetrate these terrorist cells, and second, just how good, alas, this particular operation was. The basic elements of it are ones that we've known for a long time. Even the use of an airplane, that goes back to the plans for the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. But the fact that they could do it simultaneously or nearly simultaneously in 4 different places with 4 different planes without being detected, that is, alas, very impressive and very depressing.
Already, though, serious questions being raised about just how effective the U.S. intelligence gathering community is, that it had no detection of this operation. Do you think that's fair at this time?
Well, I think we don't know the full story, and at this point I think the overwhelming failure is the one of airport security, where we've known for a long time that making airports absolutely secure is impossible. We balance between convenience and safety. But again, the fact that they were able to get on 4 different, or at least 4 different airplanes nearly simultaneously is, I think, really distressing and damaging. On the intelligence front, it looks bad. I think at this point, one wouldn't want to say more than that until we know a bit more of the details. It is a very hard problem, and our existing ways of going at it, the traditional way we've done espionage or human intelligence, isn't really suitable. You're not going to find Osama bin Laden's colleagues on the cocktail party circuit in foreign capitals have to do business a very different way. And I think in particular, and this is a check on our instincts here in the United States toward unilateralism, it really requires very good, patient cooperation with our friends and allies. Plainly, we're going to have a lot of trouble getting agents into Osama bin Laden's inner circle, but some of our friends, allies, or even countries who are not quite either may be willing to cooperate and may have a much better chance than we do.
When the United States has decided with some certainty as to who was responsible here, what kind of response do you expect to see happen?
I think we really have entered a new period. I mean, we've talked a lot in the United States about Homeland Security, and you in Canada have wondered what that meant for you. I think at this point we're now about to get serious about it, both defensively and offensively. Mr. Bush signaled in his speech tonight that no longer will we regard the states who sponsor terrorist groups as different from the terrorist groups themselves. Now, that's easily said, but very hard to do when it turns out that some of those state sponsors, in quotation marks, turn out to be friends, like Pakistan, or very complicated places like Afghanistan. But so far in the past, several years ago in Sudan and Afghanistan, our response was limited to what my friends in the Pentagon call TLAM therapy, cruise missile attacks. I think we're well beyond that, and the scale of response this time is going to be bigger, more dangerous to Americans. It is going to be much more like a real war rather than the kind of distant standoff war that has so far happily sufficed in the past.
I think we'll leave it there. We appreciate your comments, Gregory Treverton from the RAND Corporation, your analysis on this. Thank you very much. Joining us from Los Angeles tonight. Well, as we've mentioned, soon after the carnage began, the call for help was raised. And as Matthew Pace reports, people in this country were quick to answer it.
They heard the news and saw the images, then lined up to help. Giving blood in Vancouver.
We've had an unbelievable response from our donors.
In Ottawa.
Horrified. It felt like you're looking at a movie, but it's obviously not.
In Calgary.
Really wanted to, give and do what I had to do from this end.
Canadians doing what they had to do to help their closest neighbors.
There's going to be a need for immediate care and comfort. These people have obviously suffered tremendous shocks to their system.
That will direct the operation on a national level.
The Canadian Red Cross is coordinating much of the relief effort.
Tracing service, can I help you?
Helping Canadians find American friends and relatives who may have been caught in the violence.
They really want to know, are their family members involved? Are they hurt? Can they help them?
But mostly they're doing whatever they're asked to do.
Coordination is the key thing. The important thing in terms of help coming in from the outside is that it comes through the appropriate channels and that they coordinate that.
Ontario Premier Mike Harris says people in his province and others are ready to pitch in.
We have offered assistance to the United States and New York governments. I have instructed all branches of the provincial government that Ontario will provide whatever support is needed.
Doctors, nurses, emergency workers are all prepared to offer their support.
The first and foremost thing that we'll look at is whether we can offer any assistance in the healthcare field, because the priority becomes on the living.
So people such as Aliyah Galani are just waiting for the call.
If I can just help one person, I mean, it'll be a lot, but I know it's going to be a lot. I know maybe we're going to work like 16 hours or 18 hours a day when we go there, and I'm ready for that.
Ready to help out in a relief effort that's only just begun. Matthew Pace, CBC News, Montreal.
Many Canadians may want to help Americans on a personal level. The Canadian Blood Services says there will be an urgent need for blood donations in the coming days. To find out the location of clinics and the hours of operation, you can call 1-888-2DONATE. And to check on Canadians who may have been caught in the attacks, Foreign Affairs has a 24-hour emergency service. The number there is 1-800-387-3124. Be advised, both numbers, not surprisingly, are extremely busy. It has been a chaotic day at Canadian airports. All flights out were cancelled, and hundreds of flights headed for the United States landed here instead. As the CBC's Susan Ormiston reports, airports and passengers are finding it hard to cope.
It's awful. I'm afraid it's the end of the world.
Just one passenger on hundreds of aircraft destined for the U.S., but rerouted to Canadian airports. This man in Toronto hosted 200 New York guests at his daughter's wedding last night. They're stranded.
The groom's sister left a 4-week-old child with a nurse who they can't even get through. The nurse is supposed to leave. They can't even, the phones are all tied up. It's total chaos.
By mid-morning, all airports in Canada were closed. All scheduled flights cancelled.
Our priority has been to receive diverted flights that were bound to destinations within the U.S.
The same everywhere. In Halifax, 7,000 travellers stuck, many still on the tarmac tonight. In Newfoundland, up to 15,000 unexpected passengers.
City. Gander. Oh.
Vancouver took the load of Asian flights. The massive effort got thanks from Washington.
So we owe our Canadian neighbors a debt of gratitude for helping us as we redirected.
Many passengers coming off the flights here in Toronto had very few details of what had happened. They were confused and frustrated by the change in their travel plans. Their shock would come later.
Total shock and disbelief. Sounds like something out of a movie.
They turned off TVs at Pearson Airport, but in Gander, stranded travelers were horrified.
There's the plane. You can't miss that.
All over, passengers had to wait hours for luggage and then try to get a rental car, a bus, or a room. These travelers herded into a hotel ballroom. There are no more rooms.
Back on the other side of the fence, please.
Airports were on high security alert. Tactical police on patrol, dogs and bomb detection equipment in use, and in the air, too, tighter security. Unlike a weather delay or an airline strike, travelers weren't as much testy as nervous.
I just want to get out of here. I feel like a sitting duck, to be quite honest.
Even the airport chaplain had a busy day.
Every few feet, somebody would stop and talk to us. Just wanted to talk. Just wanted to let out steam.
Transport Canada will decide when planes will resume flying. For now, Canadian airports are still closed and travelers' plans in disarray.
The world's not what it was 24 hours ago.
Susan Ormiston, CBC News, Toronto.
Traffic at many of Canada's border crossings has slowed to a crawl as officials check every car, every traveller. Ian Hannamansing, the CBC's Canada Now anchor, reports from the crossing near White Rock, British Columbia.
At the Peace Arch border crossing atop the monument to the longest undefended border in the world, two flags at half-mast, half-staff. A symbol of the tragedy that today trumped the optimism of the words inscribed on the arch. May these gates never be closed. This gate to the United States was sealed shut for about 20 minutes this morning. And when it reopened, it was at the highest level of security, what customs officers call a Code 1. The last time border checks were this thorough was on the eve of the Millennium celebrations in 1999, after Ahmed Rassam was caught trying to smuggle explosives from British Columbia to Washington state. U.S. citizens were allowed slowly back into their country. Most non-Americans were turned away. These Canadians were headed to Oregon for a convention.
And then he said, I'm sorry, you cannot go through, the very easy thing. Only Americans are allowed to go through.
On the Canadian side, heightened security as well. And at a crossing where usually more than 300 cars an hour would stream past, by midday, only about 75 vehicles each hour were trickling through. One veteran police officer said he's never seen this level of security at the border.
I've been policing in this area for over the course of 35 years. As far as on an emergent reaction, no, I've never encountered this type of slowdown.
It was a similar scene at some of the other major crossings. The Windsor-Detroit Tunnel was shut down for about 5 hours. And on the Ambassador Bridge, massive backups. At Niagara Falls, no complaints about the slow traffic, but outrage from Americans over the attacks.
Whoever did it, I hope they really get the crap knocked out of them. I mean, they will, as the Americans stand together. It's a sad day for America. Still proud to be an American, but we need to straighten this out real quick and go after the parties. All-out war, that's what it is, just like Pearl Harbor.
By this evening, very few cars were arriving at the Peace Arch border crossing. Those trying to get into Canada were met by an immigration officer who verified ID papers and then a gauntlet of customs officers. An official said this methodical and unusual level of security would continue indefinitely. Ian Hannamansing, CBC News, at the Peace Arch border crossing near White Rock, British Columbia.
Let's look live again to New York City. This is the shot of the New York City skyline as rescue efforts continue in the south end of Manhattan, where the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center used to exist, but now rescue workers pouring through the rubble. Two quick things to update you on the New York story. First, in that rubble, the mayor of New York City has just confirmed that 2 police officers have been pulled out alive, their condition unknown. Those are the first survivors to be rescued from the rubble area. it is still unclear what is happening beneath the rubble in terms of other indications that people are alive. There have been reports throughout this evening of people trapped inside the rubble phoning relatives and trying to give directions as to where they are. Rescue workers trying to fight fires and gas leaks to get into those areas. The New York City police chief has confirmed a report we made earlier about 3 men stopped in a van on the George Washington Bridge heading into New York, but he has said that one part of that report that was carried in various news agencies is not correct. There were no explosives on board that van. So that a quick update on the situation in New York City. Now, the global reaction to the death and destruction, it was swift. Almost every world leader lined up behind the United States to condemn the attacks. And as Don Murray reports, they were also bracing for trouble of their own.
The world watched transfixed. This was London. It could have been any major city in Europe this afternoon. Television pictures gathered crowds. They evoked curiosity, disbelief, and then horror. Traders were moved from the London Stock Exchange. They too watched the televised pictures in disbelief. Some left one of London's main financial office buildings. American firms sent their workers home. Rapidly, police forces around the continent were put on alert. Security was noticeably heavier at the American embassy in London. By the end of the afternoon, the impact was most obvious at airports. London's Heathrow was filled with passengers whose planes, headed for the U.S., had been turned back in the air. The chorus of condemnation from European political leaders was swift and unanimous. Germany's Chancellor Gerhard Schröder talked of the revulsion his government and his country felt at these attacks. Russian President Vladimir Putin described the attacks as an evil blow against all civilized people.
То, что произошло сегодня, лишний раз подчеркивает актуальность.
What happened today, he says, underlines the importance of Russia's proposal to unite all the forces of international society to fight terrorism. Britain's Prime Minister Tony Blair emerged from an emergency meeting of his senior ministers to say his country would stand shoulder to shoulder with the U.S. in a crusade to eliminate such attacks.
This mass terrorism is the new evil in our world. The people who perpetrate it have no regard whatever for the sanctity or value of human life. And we, the democracies of the world, must come together to defeat it and eradicate it.
This evening, NATO ambassadors met in Brussels just hours after all non-essential NATO employees had been sent home from the alliance's headquarters. Tomorrow, the European foreign ministers will meet in emergency session. But this furious round of diplomatic discussion barely conceals the obvious. No one in power on this side of the Atlantic has any real idea how this happened or what will happen next. Don Murray, CBC News, London.
Now, from Europe to the Middle East, a region that's no stranger to suicide attacks. But the scope of today's events was shocking by any standards. Still, there were pockets of Palestinians who celebrated today's attacks. Joining us with the latest from the Middle East, the CBC's Neil MacDonald. Neil.
Peter, the mood here in Jerusalem, and I think it's safe to say in the Palestinian territories and elsewhere in the Arab world, is a somber one. There's a feeling here of great foreboding. If, and I say if, these attacks were perpetrated by Arab extremists, then Israel is inevitably drawn into the equation, as are the Palestinians and other Arab states. For the past year, especially since the election of President Bush, Israel and the United States of America have become synonymous in the mind of the Arab street. To a great many Arabs, both countries are now bitter enemies. And that explains some of the scenes we saw here today. In Arab East Jerusalem, groups of people took to the street, celebrating, toasting Osama bin Laden, and generally hailing whomever managed to inflict such a lethal blow against Israel's closest ally and greatest protector. There were similar celebrations in the cities of the West Bank and in the Palestinian refugee camps of Lebanon. Most Arab leaders, though, understanding the sheer foolishness of taunting Americans at a time like this, were greatly restrained.
First of all, I am offering my condolences, the condolences of the Palestinian people to the American President, President Bush, to his government, to the American people for this terrible act. We are completely shocked, unbelievable.
Palestinian extremist groups, though, issued cold denials and took the opportunity to lecture the United States. We are opposed to U.S. oppression, said this leader of Hamas, itself a group that has dispatched suicide bombers. We call upon the U.S. to take fair stands and not take Israel's side.
We deny our responsibility, but we call upon the American administration to review their attitude and their policy towards the Palestinian question, because this policy arouses the anger and the hatred of our people and of all Arab and Islamic peoples.
The terror attacks. Israeli leaders universally expressed grief and condolences and declared a national day of mourning.
The fight against terror is an international struggle of the free world against the forces of darkness who seek to destroy our liberty and our way of life.
This was not an attack just against America. It was an attack against civilization, an attempt to bring us back to a jungle where everybody will be full of fear.
On the popular Israeli political program, Popolitica, an Israeli general called for the immediate liquidation of Yasser Arafat.
What the American people
and from a former prime minister,
we here in Israel have been standing and fighting at the front line against terrorism for years. But now terrorism is struck at the heart of freedom. And this is exactly what this battle is. It's a battle between the forces of tyranny and terrorism and the forces of freedom and democracy.
And that, no doubt, is how the Arabs of the Middle East now fear the lines will be drawn, with them cast irretrievably as terrorists and the word Islam synonymous with atrocity in the Western mind. It's probably safe to say that most people here, Arab and Jew, now feel their lives have changed, and that the geopolitical lines here have shifted reality. Certainly, the current Palestinian intifada, the uprising, is going to be seen in quite a different light, beginning now. Peter?
Neil, at any time a major event has an impact on the Middle East, you have to weigh carefully the impact that it can have on either side in the historic dispute. There seems to be a sense that as awful as this is, the event that's happened in the United States today, that on the side of Israel expressing its shock and horror at what's happened, it almost seems that they feel that this can have an impact for them of a beneficial nature.
Well, Peter, you heard the sorrow and the sympathy that was expressed by Israeli leaders today, and it's genuine, but I think at the same time, there is sort of a glimmer of grim satisfaction that the rest of the world has met Israel's enemy, and in a very sudden way. You know, and I think Israeli leaders are hoping that the world will close ranks with them. That's what they're asking for. I think to a certain extent that has begun. Simply the use of the word terrorism. Western news agencies and governments have been chary about using that word with regard to this conflict up to now, viewing it largely as a political construct. That's changed. The word terrorism is certainly on our style book now, and it's being used widely by Western news agencies. And I think just that is the start of the world's perception perhaps growing a little bit closer to Israel's about this sort of thing. And that will certainly be welcome to the leadership here.
All right, and underlining, as you have been throughout the day, I know it's early tomorrow morning in Jerusalem right now in terms of the time schedule here in this side of the Atlantic, but underlining, as you have all day, still no indication who was responsible for this, all kinds of fingers being pointed, but at this hour still no firm indication of who is responsible. Neil MacDonald reporting to us tonight from Jerusalem. Now, more reaction from on the ground in the United States. Buffalo, New York is just a stone's throw from Ontario. Dan Bjarnason was in that city today. He saw people stunned, people outraged, and people desperate to help their neighbors.
In Buffalo, New York, as word of the catastrophe rippled across the city, security was tightened at many government centers, including City Hall, which shut down, and flags were lowered one by one. In the handful of shopping plazas that stayed open, there were few actual shoppers. Those few were mostly drawn to electronics stores, where they were glued to TV newscasts as the full horror grew by the hour.
It's been reported, our David Ensor has reported that
the Red Cross in Buffalo was holding blood donor clinics today, never dreaming the events in New York and Washington would become so relevant. As it turned out, this clinic was swamped. Tony Dell.
We had no way of planning for this kind of event or demand, and we didn't have adequate staff. We didn't have adequate beds. We were unprepared. But in less than 12 hours, we have beefed up everything, and we're ready to collect and process an awful lot more blood.
By coincidence, an association of several hundred healthcare workers from all across the U.S. was at a convention in Buffalo. A delegation arrived at the donor clinic wanting to figure out how they could all give blood.
I came today to donate blood to help whoever I can. Because if this was me, if this was happening to me, I'd want people to help me, definitely.
This wasn't something you planned on doing.
Drawing blood today?
When you got up this morning, you thought, let's go give blood. That didn't happen.
No. I've never donated blood in my life.
Really?
Really.
And you're in the health field.
Right. I'd love to draw blood, but I don't like to give it. But I would.
So why is today special?
Because of everything that's happened. If they need our help, we're willing to give it.
Right now, everybody's kind of living in this movie that we don't know, okay, how's it going to end, that sort of thing. And we've all talked about that at different times today, how it feels very surreal. You don't feel like it's actually happening. And you don't know, is anything else going to happen or what's going to happen if it does.
For most here in Buffalo, the mood was not one of terror, but of rage.
If I could re-enlist, I would, because I'd like to get back at the person that took the innocent lives today for no reason at all. That's got me very upset.
Others counted themselves lucky they were here in Buffalo today and not in New York or Washington, although there was great empathy with those caught up in the cities at the center of the disasters.
My dad works there, so that was my main concern, to get in touch with him and see if he was still okay or alive. And after 3 hours, I was finally able to get in touch with him and found out that he was out to breakfast across the street when it happened. Luckily, thank God.
In a day of so much unimaginable horror, a remarkable humane response across the U.S. as Red Cross blood banks gear up for an even busier day tomorrow. Dan Bjarnason, CBC News, Buffalo.
The questions of who carried out today's attacks and how burn fiercely in the minds of Americans tonight. But we do know that in the recent past, Canada has been used as a base for attempted terror attacks on the United States. The CBC's Terence McKenna has been preparing a documentary on the subject and has this report for us tonight.
The most haunting foreshadowing of today's terror attack happened in Marseille, France in 1994. French commandos stormed an Air France jet which had been hijacked by Algerian Islamic militants. All the hijackers were killed. 159 hostages were freed. 7 had been killed. French authorities said the hijackers wanted to crash the plane fully loaded with fuel into Paris, if possible, into the Eiffel Tower. The trail from that case led French investigating magistrate Jean-Louis Bruguière to uncover a worldwide network of Islamic terrorists. His work has brought him to Canada and the United States.
This cell is spreading over the world like a web. So it's very difficult to grasp this new threat. But it's very, very dangerous because their target is very different. They try to target not only France, but America.
French investigators established links that led from the 1994 hijacking through the Paris subway bombs in 1995 and 96, and the trail eventually led them to a group of terrorists in Montreal, which included Ahmed Ressam, the man arrested at the American border with powerful explosives in the trunk of his car in 1999. Salim Jiwa covered the Ressam case for the Vancouver province.
Well, I see the Ressam situation as a precursor of what was to come. I see that as I mean, the astonishing part is what Ressam was saying was the number of people who are trained. For example, he stated that 60 people are ready and on standby in Italy. He named a number of groups in Sweden, number of people in Germany. So I saw that as a precursor. I was talking to a security source in the United States and just a month ago, and he indicated that the U.S. was very nervous still that something would happen and they would be unable to stop it. He said to me that these people are not going to stop, and you know it.
Ahmed Ressam easily obtained a false Canadian passport and used it to travel to the city of Peshawar in the northwest frontier province of Pakistan. There he made contact with the Osama bin Laden organization and entered a terrorist training camp in nearby Afghanistan for months of instruction in bomb-making and assassination techniques. Islamic militants from many nations are trained in the Afghanistan camps. The bin Laden organization has been monitored for years by the U.S. security apparatus and the Situation Room at the White House. James Steinberg was Deputy National Security Advisor in the Clinton administration.
It's not simply a question of an individual belonging to one particular organization with one particular target, whether it's the GIA in Algeria or the Egyptian Islamic Jihad in Egypt, but rather a kind of loose network of people who have common affiliations, common training, common associations, frequently linked to Afghanistan, which becomes sort of a pool of individuals who may be available to be involved in terrorist operations elsewhere in the world.
The Ressam case has brought to light numerous connections between the Osama bin Laden organization and Canada.
Yes, indeed. There are other names, as you know, people who have direct telephonic links in Canada with Osama bin Laden's right-hand man, Abu Zubaydah. There are people like that in Calgary. There are people like that in Vancouver. There are people like that in Montreal. There are people like that in Toronto. Numerous telephonic links have been found with very sinister people and very dangerous people in Canada.
Suspected terrorists in Canada are monitored by the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service, CSIS, and agents like Dan Lambert.
Counterterrorism is the main priority of the CSIS in terms of its mandate. We have 2/3 of our resources are dedicated to counterterrorism. We work extremely closely with the RCMP, with the Department of Justice, with CIC and Customs within Canada, as well as U.S. authorities. And in fact, I mean, we have liaison relationships with 130 different countries and over 250 different agencies.
What's valuable about the Ressam case is that it reinforces the necessity of this kind of cooperation. As you say, there were links in not only between individuals operating in the United States, individuals operating in Canada, but also in Europe. And as we began to uncover them, I think it reinforced among officials involved in law enforcement and intelligence the critical need for this kind of transnational cooperation.
Why would Islamic terrorists come to Canada? David Harris is former Chief of Strategic Planning at the Canadian Security and Intelligence Agency.
I think in terms of Islamic extremists in Canada, they regard the proximity of Canada to the U.S. as making Canada a kind of Islamic extremist aircraft carrier for the launching of major assaults against the U.S. mainland. And that's something we've got to remember.
Today's massive coordinated attack shows a level of sophistication well beyond what had been anticipated or predicted in the North American intelligence community. Most intelligence analysts thought a conspiracy of this magnitude would show up in the massive wiretapping and monitoring of suspected terrorists.
Indeed, this is a complete failure of intelligence. The United States, Canada, and allied intelligence services for a long time will be dissecting how such a major conspiracy that must have used the airwaves, may have used the internet as a contact point, could get through and be carried out without anybody waking up. This is havoc that has been created, and I suppose many heads will roll, and there will be lots of postmortems conducted on how such a major conspiracy could be concealed.
Congresswoman Jane Harman served on the U.S. Counterterrorism Intelligence Committee and has long pleaded for more resources to deal with international terrorism.
What is very worrisome is the goals of terrorists have changed. It used to be that terrorists would try to kill a few people and make a political point. But as we stated in this terrorism report that I worked on last year, the goal no longer is a seat at the table. The goal is to blow up the table.
In the aftermath of the Ahmed Rassam case, there was a lot of finger-pointing at Canada, especially because Mr. Rassam was so easily able to take advantage of Canadian immigration and refugee regulations to remain here, and because it was so easy for him to obtain a false Canadian passport. There was a lot of American pressure on Canada to establish more stringent requirements in those areas, and after today, that pressure will surely increase. For The National, I'm Terence McKenna in Montreal.
Well, all Canadians have been shocked by what they've seen, and some of them have been contacting us. Rex Murphy has been going through the emails people have been sending us tonight. Rex, give us a sense of what you've been reading.
Well, Peter, it's